Hello, philosophy and English friends. Welcome back to episode 2 of Coffee Chats with Father. This is Pani Manager, and once again, I'm joined by Father Wojciech Grygiel. Last episode, we talked about the idea of philosophy in science, and today, Father's going to help us place this idea into more context. Father, can you talk about some major contributions to the field of philosophy and science, and mainly some notable people, ideas, anything you have to offer us to kind of develop and expand the idea of philosophy and science?
Yes, thanks again for continuing on that series. I think as we try to see more deeply what philosophy and science is, we need to focus on three major areas where the influences of ideas and development of ideas is actually visible. First of all, in philosophy in science, we are trying to see whether previous philosophical ideas would have an influence on the development of science. And some people may feel a bit opposed to it just by saying that philosophy and science have different methodological planes. But it's actually not that true, because actually there is always some interaction between philosophical ideas and what happens in science.
I definitely think, for example, some people might be inclined to say, oh, philosophy and science as two disciplines are not compatible at all.
Well, I think in some ways it's really not always a question of compatibility, but it's because about their object it probably won't be totally compatible. But I'm more inclined to think about how philosophy influences science, and moreover that some scientists, in their scientific results, they make philosophical assumptions and they rely on some kind of philosophical attitude. So this tells us that science is not happening in isolation, but science always happens within a broader cultural context. So for instance, what I would like to mention as an example, because I think example is the most illustrative in that matter, is the two famous figures of contemporary physics, which is Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. And we always hear about their scientific achievements, but much more rarely we hear that actually there was a very profound and deep philosophical dispute between them. And Roger Penrose would always qualify himself as a Platonist, while Stephen Hawking would be of much rather a positivist attitude, and they would always argue about the deepest assumptions of science. And it actually turns out that for Roger Penrose, the way he thinks philosophically actually projects on some of the outcomes of his scientific research.
How so?
We would have to go into a very kind of really elaborate physical ideas, but for instance, I think his ideas about the beginnings of the universe are very much influenced by his philosophical ideas. Also, another thing is that his major topic is that like the major fabric of the universe is mathematics, but a very specific kind of mathematics, which is the complex numbers. He has this Platonic belief that somehow the complex numbers rule the universe. So his scientific outcomes are to a visible degree determined by the philosophy he believes in.
Now, you've mentioned this guy, and that's interesting. I've never heard of him before, but I have heard of Stephen Hawking.
Yes.
And I've heard about his science, and I've heard maybe some ideas of controversy, but I've never heard him in connection to philosophy. Could you maybe fill me in on this?
Well, Stephen Hawking is a more difficult person to pin philosophically. He kind of steers towards, in broad terms, a more positivist view of science, in which science is not intended to give us any picture of the universe and answer any questions on really the fabric of the universe. Philosophically, you would say about the ontology, but he's mostly interested in that physics is just giving you the predictions of the experimental results and confirmation of the experiment observed. He's kind of he would say right out to panels that your questions are pointless. So this is, I mean, I think a good contemporary example of how philosophical ideas can influence how people do science.
And what do you think this has on the impact for people, for students, for example? As we study science, as we study philosophy, what do you think we can gain from the example of these two individuals you have mentioned?
Oh yeah, I think the key issue is that as we either do philosophy or we do science, we always have to be careful that in our different scientific projects we always make assumptions. And I think what philosophy does, it allows us to detect and isolate assumptions we make as we move along in our research. Because sometimes a wrong assumption can block our scientific discoveries. And it has been there's many examples in the history of science where just kind of wrong assumptions were really blocking the development of science.
Father, again, this was a fascinating conversation. We could probably go on for much longer, but unfortunately, we definitely will. Unfortunately for today, we're out of time. However, do you think it would be a correct assumption for me to think that we will be here next week, again talking about philosophy of science or philosophy in science?
Yeah, we'll try to dig in more into what philosophy in science means and probably come up with some even more interesting ideas.
And that being said, I'm also going to make the assumption, hopefully correct, that our viewers will join us next week as well as we continue to step into the deep and discover more about philosophy and science. Until then, Father Wojciech Grygiel and myself will wish you a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.